Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Sorin Ducaru believes in just-in-time delivery. He landed at Brussels International Airport at 11, and he's arrived. I mentioned earlier in my kickoff address that Ambassador Ducaru is a friend, colleague, former Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, and really in very much way the father of the cybersecurity strategy and a lot of the cybersecurity work that we've done in NATO and continue to do. He's now he's got a number of projects going on, essentially in the think tank community. He's particularly involved in the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. He's working with the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. And without any further bio, which you can read, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Sorin Ducaru and welcome him to the stage. Sorin, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin, and it's indeed great to be back here in Mons. This time not with responsibility and also constraints attached of a NATO official, but as a think tanker with the benefit of having quite some NATO experience over more than a decade, both on the North Atlantic Council and on the international staff, and frankly being still linked to NATO work through the being the chair of NATO Secretary General's Advisory Board on the functional review of the NATO headquarters. Now, let me start by mentioning that when I took the job as Assistant Secretary General and head of the Emerging Security Challenges Division back in 2013, the NATO threat assessment and focus in accordance with the strategic concept of Lisbon was really very much towards the 21st century, what it was called security challenges, the emerging challenges, so to say. A lot on fighting terrorism, cyber defense, impact of new technologies, and there was a sense that, yes, this is the direction of the main change, while the old kind of confrontation would be fading out. But then after 2014 and the illegal annexation of Crimea and the military buildup on the eastern frontier of NATO by Russia, I think there was a clear sense that we're living in a world of emerging and re-emerging challenges in a kind of that blend together in a kind of hybrid mix. I think it was clear to everyone that we are not in a paradigm of Francis Fukuyama of the end of history, and it's closer to what Robert Kagan wrote about the return of history and the end of dreams, but not exactly, because it's not really the return of history. It's a really new world with a combination of old kind of threats, force on force, big power confrontation with traditional military dimension, but a lot of dynamics on the front of the new technologies and the new kind of threats. And frankly, this is the world that we need to focus. So since we are close to the 70 years anniversary of NATO, my attempt today is to highlight a number of key challenges for the alliance transformation that are strategic level. Of course, the technology and industry component play a role, but they are strategic challenges, and also to try to depict how they would impact or how they should influence the NATO industry cooperation. And let me start with the first issue that I wanted to highlight to you. It's clear that we are living in an era of increasing confrontation. But it's a kind of confrontation that frankly evades and blurs the distinction between peace and war. And this is fundamental because the whole establishment of the international order, of the legal system, the institutions, UN, OSCE, NATO, were actually built to preserve peace, to avoid war, and were based on this distinction between peace and war. And if you look to Article 50 of the UN Charter, the UN Charter is all about preserving peace, with one exception, which is the right of self-defense in the case of armed attack. Article 5 of NATO, it's about collective defense in the case of armed attack. So what is armed attack? It's application of violence, of military means to achieve specific goals, strategic goals. What we're seeing nowadays more and more is actually achieving certain goals, even generating a lot of harm, a lot of strategic effects, potential damaging, even lethal effects, but without the application of violent means, application of soft means. It could be, cyber attacks that generate effects on the other end in the physical world, could blow up infrastructure from power plants to or dams and so on, or affect human lives in hospitals, or it could be information manipulation, like the throwing of the PSYOPs techniques to civilian population. And some can be so insidious that even though the attacker doesn't use violent means, they uses soft means, so to say, it can induce the victim to become violent in state of panics and so on. So I think this is fundamental because the North Atlantic Alliance, which has been built on the foundations of collective defense and Article 5, and the capacity to prevent, deter warfare, and if necessary to be ready to conduct military operations, but above the threshold of armed attack. And I think there is a need to be able to better adapt, to be able to prevent, avoid confrontation, deter, or manage, if necessary, below the threshold, the kind of area where we're living. And the truth is that there has been always a blurring between war and peace, and there was never a definition of an armed attack, neither in the UN Charter, not even in the Washington Treaty. It was also to be determined as a political decision on a case-by-case basis. But the violence element was there. Nowadays, this kind of blurring, the card has changed. It's much wider, and we need to be available to address this. And I think the NATO industry cooperation needs to have this in mind, because it's also a blurring of the civ-mil responsibility in terms of assuring stability, security, and so on. So this was number one. Number two is what I mentioned in an op-ed this spring, what I would metaphorically call a kind of analog hangover over within the way of conducting business within the alliance. And what I mean by this is that I think NATO has been really good in preserving peace and stability over these almost 7 decades, and convincingly actually deterring attack, because it was able to adapt, especially to the potential adversaries' developments, using the whole panoply from nuclear to conventional deterrence measures. But when we look at the current environment, I think we are too much still overwhelmingly focused on the physical elements of defense deterrence Well, I think it's evident that the battlefield is increasingly digital. And don't get me wrong, I really believe in hard power. I think hard power matters these days. And I'm one of those coming from a country at the eastern frontier of the alliance, so this is very much ingrained in my beliefs. But if we're not investing more into learning, understanding, applying the aspects of modern technologies, and in this case the digital world and their impact upon the physical, classical, conventional deterrence first, and maybe you read, I think there was an article a week or a week and a half ago in Defense One reflecting a report by the Government Accounting Office in the US after an audit of how much some conventional capabilities were vulnerable due to cyber attacks, for example. So look, having this in mind, I think we need to balance a bit the focus and the effort and so on. So create more capacity on the digital side at all levels, from the level of soldier to enabler or up to the political or strategic decision maker. Number 3, which is kind of linked to my second point, but I think it broadens the idea. I think it's the need to adapt to this era of really abrupt technological advancements, accelerations as it's called. And what's specific here, yes, there is the speed, and when I mentioned accelerations, it's clear. But there's something else in this area compared to previous decades. I think in the past, governments, due to the existing resources and the strategic vision, had really a lot of input in stimulating technological development, investing in it and then stimulating. And some of the important capabilities, from nuclear to advanced precision-guided munitions and so on and so forth, started from, I would say, strategic investments by government. Now, I'm not saying that governments per se are not important still into directing innovation and investment in this, but the ratio between the importance of the government vis-a-vis private sector in this kind of development, technological acceleration has changed in favor of the private sector. So these needs also to change the dynamics in the way government works with industry, with the private sector. And I think also the need to take into consideration, because this has blurred, as I said, the distinction between civil, military responsibility and also impact, I think there has to be a new approach. I would call it a multi-stakeholder approach to security. Definitely governments who have, through the social contract, a responsibility to assure security, stability for nation states, for citizens and so on. But in this era where both the technological development and the impact of harm can go directly to the citizens or to the private sector, I think this link between the three, government, industry, civil society, and kind of sharing of responsibility, needs to be addressed in a much more imaginative way. So how does this impact the NATO, or how should this impact NATO industry cooperation? That is not new. It really is long-standing. It was traditionally focused on the defense investment side, the acquisition, the procurement. It has evolved, especially through the NATO industry cyber partnership, which I was really proud to be part of the initiating group. So this was to address things beyond procurement, looking on training, education, situational awareness, stuff like this. So I think the key areas are the following. Number one, it is really important and critical to modernize the procurement, the acquisition process within the alliance and frankly within national governments altogether, to fine-tune it and synchronize it with a fast pace of technological development and accelerations, so that we are not obliged, due to the processes that are well established and they have a clear logic of fairness, of competition, and so on and so forth, but they cannot compromise the, let's say, key objective to really generate relevant capability. So we should not be condemned to always have yesterday's technologies in our national security capability development. Number two, I think the partnership, the cooperation with industry should become a bit more profound, more articulated in the areas of education, training, and exercises. I think together we can develop capacity and establish what I would say a culture of security and safety. Number three, very important to develop frameworks of situational awareness, early warning, because the industry has a lot of networks, capability, sensors all over. And we have some good examples between NATO and industry in the cyber domain through the various forms of NATO industry cooperation, from the memoranda of understanding between NCIA and a number of industry leaders to malware information sharing platforms with industry and so on and so forth. Number four, I think there should be some cooperation to really support and foster innovation. And number five, and this is my last point, because I'm also running out of my time, is to consider kind of dialogue between government organizations, intergovernmental organizations like NATO, and industry, and frankly, and the civil societies in a multi-stakeholder framework to address strategic objectives of stability in our world, because I think we need together to develop, to generate corrections to the international system that was based on the institutions of the post-Second World War, and again, based on the distinction between peace and war and the use of violence. So we need to establish a set of principles, norms, frameworks, regimes of responsible behavior that would enhance stability and actually stop the kind of bonanza of confrontation, especially in the digital world. And this is one of my main projects these days, being part of this Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, which is, by the way, developed as a multi-stakeholder group. And I think there are a lot of important initiatives by industry, like the recent tech accord among industry players, putting forward some great principles and ideas to generate stability. But again, I find this just as the beginning. So my point is to engage everyone and you to look to these issues beyond the technical, the procurement dimensions, which are important, and of course they're at the core of the concerns of the industry, but put them in a kind of strategic framework, because the world is changing in front of our eyes, and it's not just the immediate effects of the technology, they're the broader strategic ones. So thank you very much, and I'm available for questions if you have some.
We don't have the ball. We need the ball.
The ball is out there somewhere, I know that, but if there is a question or two, I see a question there. Who has the ball, or the square, the cube? Coming to you. Thank you very much.
Oh. Hey, okay, cool. So I've got a question for you, and it sounded a lot like most of your talk was about trying to figure out a way to make cyber deterrence effective. Is that? All right,
Part of what I said implies this as well.
So let's say my
Absolutely.
question's on that topic, right? So my question would be, is there currently an adjudicating body that exists that's recognized by the different stakeholders that can be used to adjudicate whether a cyber event can be attributed to a threat actor?
No, there's no such body, and frankly, I think states are pretty clear that an attribution of a cyber attack is at the end a sovereign national attribute that is based on technical analysis, on intelligence analysis, and on a political decision to make the attribution. But I mean, let me put it this way: there's no international body in other fields that let's say externalizes like the technical analysis or transfers this from the sovereign attribute of a state to a technical body. I think what is important to follow and what is important to observe in the last years is that unlike 3, 4, 5 years ago, in the last 2 years, more states have been able and willing to come forward with their analysis and with the attribution of certain attacks, starting with the DNC hack, then WannaCry, NotPetya, and so on and so forth. So as long as there's a sense of convergence among a number of states of analysis and the result of this analysis and political will to speak out, I think it's the first step in generating some deterrence, so at least not shying away. Secondly is what you do about it. What you do about it, I think I would mention that for the first time in the NATO summit communique this year, there is a sentence that speaks of allies working together to find ways to impose costs to attackers. It's not by chance, because by the end, at the end of May, the US State Department issued a document whereby it were recommendations to the US President about cooperation with partners and allies to deter cyber attacks and impose cost over the attackers. And if you look into the history, for example, there was a so-called Proliferation Security Initiative among a number of like-minded nations that established principles of non-nuclear proliferation and how to respond and generate some cost to those who were performing such proliferation. So even though we are not at a point where we have a body or an institution that does that, I think the world is changing in the sense of taking more serious the need to deter attacks by imposing costs, and not necessarily through hackback or through doing things in the cyber domain. They could be in political means, diplomatic means, economic, various means.
Right. I mean, I think I understand what you're saying, but I guess my question still remains. I think we all understand that there can be no deterrence without consequence or cost being levied on someone, but if you have no adjudication or no adjudicating body that then says this person is responsible and everyone accepts that they're responsible, therefore you are allowed to levy the cost on them, then can you really have deterrence until something is set up either in the UN or somewhere that says, okay, we say they did it, everyone accepts that they did it, there's some threshold for acceptance.
But let me be clear. The UN Charter speaks about the right to self-defense, national or in an alliance format, if a country is under armed attack. But it doesn't say that the UN says should really establish that this was an armed attack. Usually, the victim or those who are affected take a political decision to claim the armed attack and have the right to respond in self-defense. So it's not you can respond in self-defense without waiting for a resolution from the UN. Pretty much the same. I mean, of course, it has to be, you cannot play with these kind of things, because claiming something which is false has consequences, but this is how the UN, the system works. There's no global policeman. This whole international system is based by the principle of sovereign states. It's not like in a nation state where we have the law enforcement that really establishes. It's different than going to court. That's how it is. We don't have an international body that does the global policing. It is about a number of principles, a number of legal and political commitment that sovereign states took in order to assure more stability. Is the stability perfect? By no means. Do we need to do more? Absolutely. Can we harness more of the technical analysis of the private sector? Maybe find ways to get as refined technical analysis on cyber attacks? I think we should. But at the end of the day, what is demonstrated by reality is that the best attribution comes by combining technical analysis with intelligence analysis. And usually intelligence analysis, you don't go to court with it. You actually, you say you're confident that your intelligence brought you this information, and you act upon it, combining tech analysis with intel analysis. That's where we are.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. Appreciate this thought-provoking discussion and taking those good questions. So
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks.